Good evening, good morning. My name is Thomas Steininger. I welcome you to Radio Wolf, our weekly webcast for consciousness and culture. I'm happy to have with me Michel Bauwens, a theorist in the emerging field of P2P theory and director and founder of the P2P Foundation, a global organization of researchers working in collaboration and exploration of peer production, governance, and property. He has authored a number of essays, including his thesis, The Political Economy of Peer Production, and also the essay, Peer-to-Peer Relationality. Michel Bauwens, welcome to Radio Wolf.
Happy to be invited. Thank you.
Michel, if I may ask you, peer-to-peer, on one hand, I think many people know the term, but I'm not sure if everyone is exactly familiar what the term means and how peer-to-peer is something that has a cultural relevance. You founded something that's called Peer-to-Peer Foundation, and you have a whole theory about what peer-to-peer means for society. Can you let us know peer-to-peer? What is this? And how does this have an implication, how we live together in this world right now?
Yeah, so I'd like to give you a bit of a historical analogy. So, imagine we're living 2,000 years ago in a tribal environment. We lived in small communities, 70 people, 150 people. And basically everybody was more or less, related to you in some kinship way, and any problems that emerge in your society you can solve by discussing it and going to see the people. So that was peer-to-peer, but it was very much constrained by space and time. And as soon as humanity expanded its scale, we basically had to invent hierarchy, if only to manage communication. So if you have more than 150 people, this has been studied by a scientist called Dunbar, an anthropologist called the Dunbar number. You can no longer remember and trust everybody. And the cost of communication becomes very expensive. You have to duplicate it all the time. So basically, we went into a hierarchical mode, and this has been then, for a few thousand years, this was the dominant modality. Now we have invented a technology that allows us to communicate and even, produce and distribute value together in this kind of virtual space, right? We basically, almost anybody in the world today, if they want to and if they know each other's language, can connect with another person and create small communities without the limitations of the territory. And I think this is an anthropological revolution. And so technically the term comes from the technology field, because about 20 years ago we started organizing our computers in that way. So in other words, if you remember, Napster, and that was the first one. The idea that every computer would be autonomous and could freely connect with any other computer, that was called peer-to-peer. There were no longer servers in the middle. And so basically I apply this to the relational human field. We are now in theory and very much in practice able to engage in a peer-to-peer way with people around joint projects. And so if you kind of look at more recent history, you could say there was a competition between national geographical states. That's, the field of politics. And then we had the companies, which are kind of resource organizations. They are less constrained by geography, but they look at, making profit by using resources. Then we had non-profit organizations that started globalizing, think about Greenpeace, Amnesty International. but these are still basically hierarchical organizations. So what we're doing now is different. When we have a joint project like doing free software, and we are volunteering to work together, it has a lot of implications on the internal hierarchy. If we're both volunteering for a project, and you're not paying me, I'm not paying you, then there is no natural authority between us. So we have to find other ways to organize our cooperation. And so this is kind of the work that humanity has been doing for 15 years, which is trying to invent new ways of being together, of organizing based on this, peer-to-peer principle.
Fantastic. The question that comes to my mind, what you're describing sounds very much like the honeymoon time of the internet, where we hope that a peer-to-peer relationship and peer-to-peer communication would really bring equality as something that many people had a lot of hope 20 years ago. But things changed, and peer-to-peer relationship became to a big degree also our hyper-related relationship that we have right now in the world, that is again in a different way dominated by big technological companies who also use peer-to-peer technology to organize their own browsers and their own system, but do it in a way with new market power. Our communication, peer-to-peer communication, changed into Twitter communication and Facebook communication, and it seems that we see more now a reality that looks a little less utopian, more dystopian in this. First, would you agree with that? And how do you think about these changes?
Yes, I fundamentally agree, but I think it shouldn't be seen in such stark terms of, utopia versus dystopia. I rather would see this times in terms of, creating hybrid realities. So I'm more optimistic than most people, because I believe that even with Twitter, even with Facebook, even with YouTube, it has not fundamentally destroyed our ability for peer-to-peer connection. Mm-hmm. So yes, there's constraints. Yes, there's control. At the same time, fundamentally, the system has to take into account that we cannot do this. And so it's reorganizing its capacity for control based on a new situation. So imagine the 15th century. So before the 15th century, you have a monopoly on knowledge, by the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. Only the monks are really literate. It takes a long time to write a book. Most people don't speak Latin, so there is this kind of monopoly of knowledge. So then comes the invention of the printing press and all other kinds of changes that emerge. And then you have 300 years of strife between, the Catholics and the Reformation, between, different kings and princes. But eventually a new society emerges. It's not an utopia, but it's definitely a new form of society. So this is what you have to expect today. Not an utopia. We are people, we are monkeys and saints at the same time. We have to deal with power, with money, with states, with capital. And so this is what the P2P Foundation wants to do. It's not just say, okay, now that we have peer-to-peer, we are going to organize paradise for everyone, mm-hmm. but rather to look at what people are actually doing. So we focus a lot on what we call seed forms. Mm-hmm. So my view is that we are in a transition period. So we had a stable system, which has become very unstable since 2008. even more unstable now with COVID-19. And it's a type of civilization where, at least in the West, we organize some kind of agreement between capital and labor. We created welfare systems and these types of things, but at the cost of nature. So we externalized. We didn't want to see all the damage that we're doing to the natural world. And basically now we are moving to eventually, and that's what we hope, of course, a new stable system that will be one that is based on a compact between humanity and nature, kind of partnership between the humans and other living, the other living beings. This is not going to be in any way an easy transition, but I do think that the peer-to-peer is a very big part of it. So, the green is one aspect, and peer-to-peer is another aspect. So our societies are going to have to deal with this.
Can you explain?
Can
you explain this peer-to-peer revolution that we are all experiencing? I mean, people who are into technology maybe in a different way than people who are just more on the consumer and information side. There are forms of peer-to-peer collaboration that many people are not aware of. How you can work together on peer-to-peer virtual networks. We see new forms of labor being organized. We see new forms how democracy organizes itself. We see new form how media information organizes itself. The question is, if you just from your own understanding and from your researches, if you step back a little bit and look what's going on in the big scale, like you described the transition from the medieval times to early modernity, there was a system change going on that I think when you were living in the 1500s, you had not really an idea what you were in the midst in. And it was hard to see what is the new, what is emerging here. And it was also kind of hard to really get it down, what is the old that is kind of grumbling. It's maybe a little too much to ask because we are in the middle of it, but people who really have looked at and thought about it a lot, what do you think is the old that is kind of falling apart right now, and what in a bigger scale is the new that is emerging?
Yes. So let me give you first, again, an historical analogy, but this time the 11th century. Mm-hmm. So we have the decomposition of the Roman world. And until the 10th century, a lot of instability, etc., etc. Once the 11th century start, we see the revival of the cities. So basically, we had an agricultural revolution, we had a social revolution, and the surplus of the people in the countryside start going to the cities, where they have no power, no solidarity mechanisms, and they're going to organize themselves in guilds. Mm-hmm. And for 300 years, a lot of cities in Europe, in Western Europe especially, were actually managed by these merchant and worker guilds, right? Mm-hmm. So they created commons, and around that they created an institutional structure that worked for them. And there was some kind of merger between commons and markets that gave us the medieval free cities. Okay, so now this kind of mechanism is, for me, is working in a virtual way. So if you look at the social structure, the people that have a stable salary, that is diminishing every year. Mm-hmm. And the people who work on a project basis, who are freelancers, autonomous workers, all kinds of new statutes, they are increasing. And for these people, the digital commons are very important. And one of the things they're doing, and this is what I call peer production, is that people start creating commons together. So this can be free software. This can be open designs. This can be all kinds of mutualizations, because we didn't talk about commons, but I want to say a word about commons, actually.
No, I just wanted to ask you, because you introduced the word, and I think it is decisive for what you try to explain to.
Yes.
And as we have not introduced it yet, what is it, commons?
Yes. Okay. So, but let me finish what I was trying to explain here. Is that so people are now saying, okay, let's do Linux, let's do Arduino, let's do civic drones, and they are now able to organize themselves and to globally scale projects. And this is very visible, for example, in the COVID-19 crisis. I'm not sure about Germany, but in many Western countries, there is market and state failure. Hospitals don't have enough medical supplies. And we have this amazing worldwide mobilization of makers and open source communities who are producing masks and PPE equipment and ventilators. So I think this is a good example of what I'm talking about, this capacity of civil society to self-organize at scale. Okay, let me introduce the words commons. Mm-hmm. So there's basically 4 ways in which we can exchange things in the world. One is the gift economy. So I give something to you, and you feel obligated to give something back to me. It doesn't have to be the same as in an exchange system, but there is a reciprocity that is required. Another method is redistribution. So we have a state system, and basically you pay taxes, and in return we protect you, and we create social security. So that's redistribution. And the third one is market. And the fourth one is very important. It's really common, which is about creating shared resources. Mm-hmm. So the first type of commons were natural resource commons. For example, fishermen will make an agreement about who can fish when and where, so that the amount of fish is not overfished. Before we had capitalist enterprise, this was the way most fishing was done. Or in the mountain areas of Austria and Switzerland, the mountain flanks are commons. So it's the people in the village who manage it and who say, okay, this family can go on Mondays, this family can go on Tuesdays. You cannot go there for 2 months during winter time. So there's rules that are collectively arrived at. Mm-hmm. And so there's 3 things. 1, a shared resource. 2, a community which creates and maintains it. And 3, they do this with their own rules. So it's a resource, it's a human activity and choice, and it's also another way of governing society that is not state-based and not market-based. And this has always existed. It was dominant in the tribal civilizations, but it had a big part in feudal society as well. If you were a farmer in Germany, until the 1700s, you would have the land of the Lord, you'd have your own plot of land for the family, and you had a common land. And actually the most important Catholic ritual in the Middle Ages was in English it's called the beating the bounds. So everybody in the parish would every year make, circle around the commons of the village and establish the local identity as a community around their common ground. Mm-hmm. And the problem is that capitalism has abolished this. So this is called the enclosures, became very prominent in the 16th century, where the nature of property changed from something that was more communal to something that was absolute and personal. Mm-hmm. So then what, the owners would do is think that, okay, I can make more money with sheep than with people. So I'm going to put property markers and make sure that people are ejected. So this happened in the 16th century and then created the conditions for the capitalist system to emerge. So this is important because the capitalist system was actually based on enclosing and privatizing the commons. This is why we know so little about it in the West. We're no longer familiar with this, right? Because it's being pushed to the marginal place. But because of the knowledge infrastructure that we built, the internet, because people were suddenly able to work together online and create common knowledge resources, the commons has re-entered our consciousness. And then in 2008, when the big financial crisis hit us, there was a second wave, an explosion of urban commoning. So I did a study in the city of Ghent, which is about 300,000 people in the north of Belgium. And we counted 500 urban commons projects in 2006 and 500 in 2016. Mm-hmm. Right? So there is a re-emergence of the commons. There's just no doubt in my mind about this, that this is something that is becoming important again. And I want to make one important argument to you. The only human institution that has been able historically to manage resources over the long term is not a market and is not a state, but it's the commons. If you don't have commons, markets and states, which are competitive systems, will overuse their resources. Uh-huh. And so we are back in a period of human history where we absolutely need to mutualize again in order to bring down the human footprint. Mm-hmm. And so this is really why the commons are so important.
Yeah. So if I may come, that's fantastic. If I may come down back to the question, what do you see is falling apart here, and what do you see is emerging? You partly answered it by basically saying something that has gone to the background, the commons, through the development of market economy, capitalism, seems to be now with the emergence of the digital world to come new to our awareness and be part of how we deal with each other. Can you go a little more into the vision of what you're seeing? What is really happening beside the details, or if we connect the details and see the patterns behind the change that we are living in here right now? What is this change about?
Okay. So I think that every big civilizational change is a change in value system. So let me give you an example. We have the Roman system, which is based on slavery, and the rulers believe that work is for slaves. It has a negative connotation, and the word, the Latin word for work means yoke. It's what, you put on the cattle. The Christians come with, the new type of feudal medieval society. They say ora et labora. In other words, we have to pray and to work. That is a value revolution, because suddenly work becomes positive. So now we're in a similar situation where we had 300-400 years in which value was based on extractive activity. So we have to extract natural resources from the land, from the ground, and we have to create profit from work. That creates value. What we do not take into account at all is what we call externalities. And they're not really externalities, but that's how economists call them. So all the damage that we do is not part of our accounting system. So it's not something that we see. And all the work that is done, what I call regenerative work, that, caring for children, caring for the elderly, improving the health of the soil, this is not recognized as a value creation activity, right? So what peer production and the commons bring today as a new conception of value is the idea of contribution. So here's an example of what a peer production community will do. They will tend to say, okay, we are all making this piece of free software together, and we want to recognize all the people who contribute to this common project. And this is very important because if only some people profit from the work of the many, then certainly in a voluntary system, most people will stop contributing. So basically the idea is that you create a membrane around your peer production community, around the commons, and you create a new way of distributing value internally. So this is called contributive accounting. And I did a study a few years ago, which was called P2P value. 75% of the 300 communities that we studied were practicing and experimenting with contributory accounting systems. So I hope you can see this is a very different way of deciding what is value, right? And the way I see human evolution occurring is when a system is in crisis and the old logics no longer work, then people look to alternatives. And the pioneers are the people who are producing the seed forms and eventually arrive at successful experiments of doing things differently.
No, I see what you're pointing to. My question is that definitely is happening. It's definitely very exciting, but is it more than a fringe reality, or can you make an argument that this is something that really means something about systems change? Because these communities, they exist since the internet exists and they have their contribution, but it seems that the main development goes into the big tech companies, that the peer-to-peer development seems not to be the main way how the digital economy is organizing itself. You seem to see that there's something happening which shows that this is something that is already showing us part of our future. How do you see that?
Yes.
Where do you see that?
Okay. So first, let me make kind of an argument about how this change generally happens. So you have a minority. So you have people inventing patterns. Let's think about the 15th century. Some people invent purgatory, which is an ideological revolution because it suddenly allows Christians to lend money. Some other people invent a printing press. And roving mobile printing companies that can make books very, very quickly in the different European cities that allow it. Some Franciscan monk in Italy invents double entry book accounting. So all this eventually, will become a practice from the merchant class, and eventually will evolve to become a fully grown capitalist system, right? So you have the patterns, then you have the subsystems, then you have some kind of crisis. So this is the second step. The first step is you're a minority in emergent system within a dominant system which is different. Then think about the 18th century. Suddenly we have a declining feudal class, a growing industrial class, and we have these absolute kings that keep the peace because there's some kind of standoff in society. And only then do we have the revolutions of the, French and Russian and all of that, right? So this is a bit the way I see it. We're now in the phase of emergence. But what we see is, for example, think about technology. It's a very good example. The new powerhouses are actually open source companies. So IBM is no longer, a hardware company. It's basically a Linux consulting company. So, for example, open source has already become basically the standard now in the software industry. And the old forces are trying to integrate this in their power and business structures. So you have to see it as a struggle, right? So for me, if capitalism exists, it's because the capitalists in Europe, the merchants, had 200-300 years in their autonomous cities, so that they didn't have big emperors and kings that could constrain them. And so they created slowly a world that was adapted to their needs and desires. And I think so what commoners are doing today is creating a world that corresponds to their needs and desires.
Mm-hmm.
So these are not things that change from one day to another, but they are long-term processes which become stronger and stronger. And you look, for example, there was a report in 2011 that the 1/6 of the US economy was already depending on commons, so shared knowledge resources. And then that attracts companies that work around it, and so a new ecosystem emerges that is controlled by capital, but has to recognize and work with open source communities. So when IBM joins Linux, it can actually not dominate the Linux space. It has to take into account the whole ecosystem. And so when you look at the blockchain space, I don't know if your readers will be familiar with this, but the idea is a distributed ledger. So the idea is to move from closed competitive entities to open collaborative systems. So the blockchain is open source. Mm-hmm. It's also extractive, so I have my own critiques on the blockchain space, but I think it's very important to see that what they're creating are essentially open collaborative systems that cannot be dominated by any single company. So what I'm trying to describe to you is a multiple history where you have what I call netarchical capitals, so centralized companies trying to control, peer-to-peer exchanges and communications. Think Facebook, Google, Airbnb. This is already a big change because normally a normal capitalist company hires people to work and then creates a profit through that, labor as a commodity with salaries and stuff. You look at Facebook and Google and YouTube, they have very few employees. They're basically directly exploiting human cooperation, right? So then we have the blockchain space, which is distributed, but still profit-oriented. So I call that distributed capitalism. This is a second form. Then we have a third form, which is all the people trying to create local economies, doing organic co-ops, energy co-ops, collective purchasing of food. I think you're probably very familiar with that world in Evolve. Yeah. And then we have the global open source communities, which, share knowledge at the global. So these four formats have different logics, but they're all co-evolving. And you are absolutely certain to say that today, power is still very much concentrated and maybe more than before. But at the same time, the other world is not disappearing. It's also strengthening in some way.
But what is your argument that this other world will kind of be a powerful force of the future? Because one could make the argument, yes, what you're describing seems to be very true. This peer-to-peer thing, open source, seems to be happening. The biggest open source that I'm aware of is Android. But Android is definitely dominated by in complete dependence by a company like Google.
Google, absolutely, yes.
You mentioned Uber and other companies who kind of use peer-to-peer realities, but create new forms of dependence. So is the new world that you're describing just a new world that uses peer-to-peer realities, but in the end, just reorganize our dependence in different technological ways?
Well, the thing is, you have to see this as both, creation and struggle, right? So my view is the following. So right now we have commons that are exploited and controlled by capital. And we basically need to do what the workers in the medieval cities did, which is we have to create market forms that are generative to the commons. So we have to create co-ops. We have to create solidarity economy. We have to create all kinds of purpose-driven, mission-oriented entities that can work and create value around the commons. This is not something that you can do fast. This is something that requires experimentation. But one of the strategies that I see as interesting is to find a connection between the open source model and the cooperative model. For example, today we have more people working for co-ops than working for multinationals. So we actually have a capitalized, cooperative sector, which could connect and kind of find convergence with the open source models. But I guess my most important argument is a negative argument, is that the current system, based on infinite material growth, is simply not a realistic option for the future. And so now we have two models. We have neoliberal globalization, which is in crisis. And actually, you look at the statistics, we now actually deglobalizing already since 2008, and COVID-19 will strengthen this because a lot of countries are discovering they're too dependent and they want more resilience. The second model, which I don't think is a good model, is a protectionist model, Brexit, Trump, etc. And this is not a good model for me because it creates win-lose competition between nation states at a moment where actually we can only solve a huge number of issues at a global scale. And so what we propose is a third model that we call cosmo-local production, where you say, okay, everything that is light is global and shared, and everything that is heavy is relocalized to the measure it's possible. So to use a difficult word, we talk about the subsidiarity of material production. Where does it make sense to relocalize, but at the same time organize the knowledge at a global basis? You can see this, for example, in permaculture. Permaculture is definitely very local, but it's organized globally. There's if you want a certification, you have the global permaculture certification. People are constantly globally connecting with each other and sharing knowledge, their knowledge base. I think if you look carefully for this, which is of course what I'm doing professionally, you will see this model emerging, and it appears to be marginal. Because if you look at your city, you will see, 4, 5, 10, 15 permaculture projects. But think about it. Every city is doing this at the same time.
No, that's a really very fascinating argument. And as I'm listening to you, a term came to me, and I have no idea if you're using the term, but it fits because you brought this negative argument, how basically the old systems are obviously failing, and many people are aware of this. And it seems also when you're describing permaculture, how it's a very local thing, but it's organizing itself in a global peer-to-peer reality. Are we creating something like a global peer-to-peer consciousness sphere?
Yes, actually, there is some proof of this. So when we did this P2P value study, one of the things that came out of it was that people were actually identifying with their projects on a global scale. And a lot of young people today, if you talk to them on the street, they don't say, I work for the postal service. They will say, I do Linux, or I'm a maker, right? So this is a shift from a labor consciousness to a contributory consciousness. So you are what you contribute to. So I think people increasingly, especially young people, they look for a passionate pursuit, then they try to make a living with it. And their consciousness is already part of this idea that they're doing something together with other people in the whole world. And so that's what I call cosmolocal, because you have both aspects at the same time. So we shouldn't think just international. We should think translocal and transnational. And just to finish this idea, we don't necessarily need nation states to do this. We could, for example, have a shared mobility co-op, like Fairbnb. It's like an alternative to Airbnb. And a number of cities in the world could say, we want to promote Fairbnb because it has better effects on our local economy than Airbnb, which creates gentrification and all kinds of social issues, right? So they create what I call a protocol cooperative, a joint software base that can be used by all participating cities. So suddenly you actually have created a new power base, right? That is not local, that is not national, but it is translocal. So these are the new forms of governance we have to be looking for. And I know this is really happening. For example, this is small examples. Barcelona and Amsterdam are sharing their cooperative housing experience. Very interestingly, in Italy, some years ago, they introduced a constitutional amendment around subsidiarity, which means that, the locus level is the best for, administration purposes. This was used by the city of Bologna a few years ago to create a public commons cooperation protocol. It's called the Bologna Regulation for the Care and Regeneration of the Urban Commons. This has now been copied by 250 cities and has mobilized 1 million Italian people in doing urban commoning.
So if I may, yes, this is really very fascinating, because if I may just use this example that you're bringing, and I connect it also to the permaculture that you were bringing before, because it has the same pattern. It's a local event that seems to make a lot of sense and has a power, and it is spreading globally through a peer-to-peer relationship, like permaculture, which originally came from Australia, now is basically spreading all over the world. Or this example from Bologna that I had no idea of that it exists, and you're saying it's copied by cities around the world. There is a commons that maybe we have not talked about, but seems to be related. I would call it, in lack of a better word, the commons of consciousness. Being aware of something together on a global scale, things that work locally, and we contribute as we are contributing in this conversation right now. You're sitting in Thailand, I'm sitting in Germany. We're having a conversation about the change of our society, and we are contributing, particularly you are contributing with your experience to an understanding of what's going on. Our listeners, who have their own backgrounds and their own conversations, are profiting from your contribution, but it is an ongoing share experience that in the common sphere of the digital sphere in consciousness is building itself as a commons. Can we talk about this in this way?
Yes. So for the first thing I want to say is that, what we're doing is we're creating protocolary organizations. In other words, we're sharing protocols. Think about Occupy and 15M. These were political movements that said, okay, we are going to occupy the square. We're going to use mic check. We're going to use XYZ. And if you accepted these protocols, you could say to yourself, I'm an Occupy, right? And they mobilized millions of people for, about a year and a half. The Yellow Vests is another example, the 15M movement in Spain, which mobilized 15 million people. Now, they're not perfect because they are not productive organizations. So as soon as the political battle kind of was, either derailed or lost, they imploded. But people that are doing permaculture, they're actually constructing something together, right? And I often say commoning is caring. And so you have a shared object You all love the shared object, and that creates a link between all of us. So this is how we organize. We organize by affinity around shared projects. And we're no longer limited by geography in spreading those practices. This is very important. This can now go very, very fast. Something that works in one place can be copied in another place. They tinker with it, they improve it. And this is happening with many, many things. And it's a good example. So what I want you to kind of see is we have a mainstream system which is weakening, and we have an emergent P2P ecosystem which is strengthening. Mm-hmm. And at some point, think about the Roman Empire. Suddenly the cities were imploding. So where do you go? Well, you either join a feudal lord who offers you protection, or you join a monastery, right? Which organized up to 25% of the population at some point. So it's because they already exist seed forms that they could kind of sell at some point. I don't know if you're familiar with the Sister Sensius, which is a very good example. This is a Catholic order, mm-hmm. and they have hermit monks and other monks. So you have 12 hermit monks, 24 normal monks, and when they reached 48, they had to split. In about 70 years, you had thousands of these monasteries all over Europe, responsible for 90% of technological innovation, and 70% of the new land that was developed in Europe in those centuries, right? So this is a very interesting example, because now, for example, we have maker movements, we have fab labs, we have co-working spaces, and there's one thing you want might to know. It's called multi-factory model. These are craftspeople who organize themselves in an open source way. They look for, old factories that they can take over. And there's 120 of them in Europe. And visible factory, right? This is their contributory identity. They're doing something good for the world at the same time. And the way you organize yourself, yes. So sorry. Okay. Yeah.
No. It's very fascinating. We are also at the end of our time, I very much appreciate that you bring all these positive examples, because they just show that something is real going on, and I think you're also showing the potential of this and how this really holds the potential of birthing something new for all of us. If people want to connect more with your work and your thinking, maybe this is the last question: where should they look? Where can they find more about your ideas of peer-to-peer and commons?
Okay, first of all, I will share my easy email, which is michel@p2pfoundation.net. michel@p2pfoundation.net. So I'll try to answer all the emails. The second thing is we have a wiki.p2pfoundation.net with 22,000 articles. And it's very well organized. For example, I'm sure you're not familiar with it, but I have a section on P2P accounting with 400 examples.
Interesting.
I have a section on facilitation methods. I have a section on participatory spirituality methods. So everything that's peer-to-peer in the commons in every domain of human activity, we try to monitor and learn from. And you find that on p2pfoundation.net.
Michel, thank you so much for this conversation. And I think you really also made your case that something really important is going on here, and there's a lot of potential, and it's worth looking, because it is part of what is changing our society. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for your interest, and I hope your readers will be interested as well.
Thank you.